It's my pleasure to introduce our guest tonight. In 1897, I'm a history teacher, so that's how I start everything. In 1897, the outgoing president was a man named Grover Cleveland, and he was cleaning out his desk at the White House. The incoming president was a man named William McKinley. Cleveland was a Democrat, McKinley was a Republican. And Cleveland passed a note to the incoming president. And he said, I know you're going to bring your own staff in, I know you're going to bring your own people in, but there's one person that's been on my staff, such as it was, and I think you should hold on to him. His name is George Cortelyou, and he's been a loyal secretary to me, and he would be an asset to your team. And McKinley took him up on it. It was a different day. McKinley said, I'll take him. And Cortelyou became one of McKinley's secretaries. Now, under Cleveland, Cortelyou had overseen a staff of 6 clerks, and that was it for the entire White House. McKinley came in wanting to modernize the presidency, wanting to transform it and make it more efficient, and Cortelyou became his right-hand man in this endeavor. Cortelyou actually became the first chief of staff for the White House. By the time he left the position in 1901, he oversaw a staff of over 30, and the White House was well on its way to being a modern and organized institution. Only one other chief of staff has served in that position longer than our guest tonight. No, only one other person has so closely experienced the inner workings of the presidency as an institution than our guest. That puts him in very select company, and it puts us in very select company. Andrew Card is a native of Massachusetts. He's a graduate of South Carolina with a degree in engineering. He attended the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy and the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, and served in the Navy from 1965 to 1967. He got his start in politics as an elected official in the Massachusetts House of Representatives, where he served from 1975 to 1983. In 1982, he was named Legislator of the Year and received a Distinguished Legislator Award from the Massachusetts Municipal Association. He was a candidate for governor of Massachusetts in 1982. From 83 to 87, he was a special assistant and then deputy assistant to President Ronald Reagan, and in 1988 was Reagan's Director of Intergovernmental Affairs, in which capacity he was the liaison between the administration and state governors, state elected officials, state legislatures, and other officials like that. He was Deputy Chief of Staff for President George H.W. Bush and served as his Secretary of Transportation in 1992 and 1993. In the 1990s, he worked in governmental relations with General Motors and was the president and the CEO of the American Automobile Manufacturers Association. And then he came back to the center of things. He was President George W. Bush's chief of staff from January 2001 to April 2006. And he became part of history. He became a key figure in one of those "do you remember where you were when" moments. If you shut your eyes, on September 11th, George W. Bush is in a classroom in Florida, taking part in a project with the teacher and the students. Someone comes in from the president's right, whispers in his ear that the U.S. is under attack. And that man is our guest this evening. He saw leadership in a time of crisis. He's now an executive director in the office of the provost at Texas A&M, having served as the acting dean of the Bush School of Government and Public Service at A&M from July 2011 through August 2013. Please join me in welcoming to Baylor University, Mr. Andrew Card.
Thank you, David.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you, Judge Starr, for being here, and thank the Jackson family. And this is a great tribute to Laura, and I feel privileged to be part of it. Thank you very much. I can say howdy because I'm at Texas A&M, but you would have to listen to me with a Boston accent. So I park the car in Harvard Yard every once in a while, and you may not understand me. That was a very kind introduction, and I have to admit, I was thrown back, and I have to throw out an old date as well. 1776, on this day, George Washington got his first honorary degree, and he got it from Harvard, and it was because he led the battle that caused the British to leave Boston Harbor. So, Evacuation Day, most of you think that it's St. Patrick's Day. In Suffolk County, Massachusetts, Evacuation Day when the British were driven out of Boston, and that was March 17th, 1776, and George Washington had commanded a troop that came down from Fort Ticonderoga, and just the threat of the cannons caused the British to leave, and it was George Washington's very first victory. And as a result, Harvard gave him an honorary degree, and they don't give many out. In 1790, on this particular day, there was something that happened that every Secretary of Transportation and now the Secretary of Homeland Security celebrates, and that was the founding of the Coast Guard. So the oldest service in the United States that helps to protect us is the Coast Guard, and they're celebrating their birthday today. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here to honor Laura Jackson by talking about kind of the situation that I experienced where we saw a world transformed, not as we would wish it had transformed, but a transformation that took place nonetheless. David was very kind to cause you to reflect back on a day that we promised never to forget, September 11th, 2001. That day was a glorious day in America. There was not a cloud in the sky in any of the lower 48 states. The president woke up in Sarasota, Florida, and he went to a school, and he was going to talk about leaving no child behind in education. And it was going to be an easy day, a day of celebration, a day of hope, a day of promise, a day that would make a difference. But it was going to be a difference for young people. I did walk into that classroom, and I did deliver a message that I never thought I would have to deliver. I guarantee a president didn't expect to hear that message. And it was certainly not a venue where a president would be expected to hear hardly any message of concern. And I did go into the classroom after he had been told, as he waited to go into the classroom, that it appears a small twin-engine prop plane had crashed into one of the towers at the World Trade Center in New York City. And our reaction was, oh, what a horrible accident. The pilot must have had a heart attack or something. And then the principal of the school escorted the president into the classroom. The door shut, and I was standing there when the acting national security advisor on the trip, the director of the White House Situation Room, a Navy captain by the name of Deb Lauer, came up to me and said, "Sir, it appears it was not a small twin-engine prop plane. It was a commercial jetliner." And my mind flashed to the fear that must have been experienced by the passengers on the plane. They had to know it was losing altitude. But that thought didn't last very long, because a nanosecond later, Captain Lauer came up to me and said, "Oh my gosh, another plane hit the other tower at the World Trade Center." And my mind actually flashed to three initials, UBL. Osama bin Laden. I had known about the attacks on the World Trade Center in 1992, and I don't know why that's where my mind went, but that's where it went. And then I performed a test that chiefs of staff have to perform all the time, and it's usually a pretty tough test. Does the president need to know? Yes. I made a conscious decision to pass on two facts, make one editorial comment, and do nothing to invite a question or a dialogue, because I knew the students that were in front of the president were second graders. and that there was a pool of media watching every single moment. I opened the door to the classroom, and the students were having a dialogue with the president. It was kind of a directed dialogue. The teacher would say good morning to the president. And they would say, good morning, Mr. President. He'd say good morning to them. I didn't want to interrupt that dialogue. And I remember looking over to the press pool, and Ann Compton from ABC News spotted me. It was unusual for me to enter the room after the president had gone in. And she said, and I said, and she said, what? And then the instructions were given to the students to take out their books. And that's when I walked up to the president and leaned over and whispered into his right ear, a second plane hit the second tower. America is under attack. I stood back from the president so that he couldn't ask me a question. I saw that his head was bobbing up and down. I then went back to the door in the classroom, and in my peripheral vision, I saw Secretary Rod Page, the Secretary of Education, and the principal of the school, and an advisor at the White House, Sandy Kress from Texas. In my right peripheral vision, I saw Ari Fleischer, the press secretary, huddled with reporters. And then I looked straight ahead, and I saw very, very innocent second graders. I was pleased the president reacted the way he did. He did nothing to introduce fear to those young people. He did nothing to demonstrate fear to the media that would have translated it to the satisfaction of the terrorists all around the world. I was also pleased that he stayed there because it gave me a chance to do my job so that he could do his. And he did a fabulous job that day. He rose to the role of being president. I'm not sure that he understood the real job of being president, even when he took the oath of office. But hearing the words, America is under attack, I think he recognized that his constitutional responsibilities really define the job. And the oath that is in that Constitution, Article 2, calls for him to preserve, protect, and defend. And there is no conditional clause. He just has to do it. I was very proud of the leadership he displayed that day. And most people think that would end up being my most memorable day at the White House. It's a day that we promise never to forget. The tragedy, the heroes, the sacrifices, the first battle of the war on terror by civilians on a plane that was driven into Shanksville, Pennsylvania, protecting people in Washington, D.C. from indescribable carnage. And it was a memorable day, but it was not my most memorable day at the White House. Since a crisis is what I was invited to talk about, or how to manage a crisis, I didn't want to talk about that day because the crisis happened that day. But managing the crisis began in earnest once the fog had lifted and the truth was known. My most memorable day at the White House was a Friday, September 14th, 2001. As I said, we knew about the attack by then. We'd visited the people who were maimed at the Pentagon. We'd talked to the governors and the mayors. We'd planned a presidential trip. The White House staff, sheepishly and with fear, came back to work at the White House. And I woke up very, very early and hopped into my car driven by a sergeant in the Army and went to the office. And I would arrive very early. If you're the chief of staff to a president, you always arrive very early. My day would start about 5:30 in the morning. I got to the office that morning and went to my desk, and The most important document that everybody told me to look at was always right front and center on my desk. And I had a rule: I read everything that the president reads, and I read some things he doesn't. But I would read this document. It's called the PDB, the President's Daily Brief. It's prepared by the CIA. And it's one of those documents in Washington, D.C. where everybody wants it, but they can't say they need it. The president needs it. And I had to help him understand it. So I sat down to read the document. Normally that document would be about 10 or 15 pages long. And it was always exciting, always a little bit scary. But this particular morning, the document, it was thick. And I looked at it and I think, it's like the New York City phone book today. And I'm trying to plow through the document and read every word. And I realized the CIA became the CYA that day. Because there was no analysis. It was all kind of right there. You'd figure it out. And then this little box on my desk started to flash. And it really was not that much of a high-tech device, but it was kind of cool. It let me know where the president always was. So I knew what room he was in, or if he was getting in a car or on a plane. I knew where the first lady was. I knew where the vice president was. I knew where the second lady was. I knew where Condi Rice was. And I knew where Jenna and Barbara were. That was usually the most exciting part of the day. Well, this device would flash whenever the president was moving from one room to another room. And the device was put there by the Secret Service so that I could keep tabs of the president. And it was flashing earlier than normal. And I wasn't too happy because I hadn't finished reading everything on my desk. And the flashing meant the president was on his way to the Oval Office to do some work. I jumped up from my desk and I ran down to the Oval Office, and the president is opening the door from the Rose Garden and walking in. And I got to exercise a privilege that I exercised many, many days. What a great privilege it was when I would say, "Top of the morning, Mr. President," as he would come to work. And I said, "Top of the morning, Mr. President. Let me tell you what your day is going to be like." And I started telling him about his day. And then he interrupted me. He said, "I'll tell you what my day is going to be like." That was not comforting when you're in charge of his day. And he said to me, "I want you to bring the FBI director over here this morning. I want a briefing from the FBI. Find out what they're doing." Now, that doesn't sound odd to you, probably. But the truth is, after Watergate, FBI directors didn't come to the White House to brief the president very often. Nobody wanted the perception that politics might influence what the FBI was doing. So it was not a normal occurrence for the FBI director to come to the Oval Office. But I said to the president, "Yes, we'll do that. I'll get him over here. Why don't we do it at 8:20, right after your CIA briefing?" He said, "That's fine." And the president went behind his desk and he sat down and he immediately started to work. But he started to work the same way I had seen him work every day that I'd gone to the Oval Office. He opened a book of devotionals. That big PDB was sitting right beside the devotional book. But the devotionals get opened first. I went out and I called the FBI director, suggested that he should come and be at the White House, ready to go to the Oval Office at 8:20. I then called the Attorney General, the chain of command, so that the Attorney General will know that he would be welcome to come as well. Stuck my head back into the Oval Office, told the president they were all set, they'd be there at 8:20, and then I went to a senior staff meeting in the Roosevelt Room, which is right across from the Oval Office in the West Wing of the White House. And that's where the senior staff gathers every morning, and we would meet for 30 minutes and outline the day, go over the current news, what was happening on Capitol Hill, and traditionally I would get up and leave at 2 minutes of 8 and walk across the hall to the Oval Office to be there when the president would meet with the director of the CIA, a briefer from the Central Intelligence Agency, and the National Security Advisor, the chief of staff, and the vice president would be there to get a briefing. At 8:20, by the way, the briefing that morning was memorable, but not that memorable from the CIA, because their job was to kind of anticipate what else was happening around the world. I got up at 8:20 and I went out to see if the FBI director and the attorney general were there, and they were there, and they had brought a briefer with them. Stuck my head back into the Oval Office and I said, everybody's all set, and he said, bring them in. And everybody shuffled around on the couches in front of the fireplace in the Oval Office. And I remember a briefer sat just to the president's left. The briefer was sitting on the couch. The president was sitting on a chair in front of the fireplace. And the FBI director sat in a chair right down at the end of the couch. The attorney general sat to his left. And everybody shuffled around on the couches and took their spots, and the briefing began. The president turned to the briefer opened his mouth and said, let me tell you what we're doing. And the discussion was really interesting, but it was all about their investigation. This is how we're conducting the investigation, this is where we're looking, this is what we think. And the president, I remember, then interrupted the briefer and said, this is really interesting, and I want to know all about it. But of greater concern to me right now is, what are you doing to prevent the next attack? And the briefer looked down the couch to the chair where the FBI director was sitting, and then the FBI director, who'd only been on the job for 10 days, looked over to the Attorney General. The Attorney General looked back at the briefer. The briefer looked back at the FBI director, and the FBI director said to the president, Mr. President, we'll have to get back to you on that one. It sounds bad, but it wasn't. It was just a reality. The briefing ended, and as everybody is getting up to leave the Oval Office, I would usually try to find a corner to hide in, but there are no corners in the Oval Office. So I would stand beside the grandfather's clock, and I'd stand beside that clock, and everybody would come out of the Oval Office and pass by me. And I remember the FBI director passing by me, and right behind him was the briefer. And I heard the FBI director turn to the briefer and said, as soon as we get back to the Bureau, we're changing the mission of the FBI. Our number one mission is now preventing the next attack. And I remember being struck by that. They left. Everybody else left the Oval Office. The president comes over to me, and he's standing in front of the grandfather's clock talking to me, and talks about the briefing, and he says, Andy, I want to convene the War Council tomorrow. And I'm thinking to myself, there is no such thing as the War Council. But I knew exactly what he meant. And I said, yes, sir, why don't we do it at Camp David, 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, Saturday morning. He said, that sounds great. So I went out and I made the phone calls to the people that should be invited to the War Council meeting at Camp David the next morning. I came back to the Oval Office having made those phone calls, and the president was talking with his assistant in charge of the cabinet, the assistant to the president for cabinet affairs. And the president was getting ready to go to a cabinet meeting. Cabinet meetings are very structured, and the president was given kind of talking points and cue cards and questions to ask. And the president was looking through the questions and being briefed by the assistant to the president for cabinet affairs. And then he stood up, and we kind of all walked into the cabinet room, and everybody in the cabinet room stood. Then the president went and took his seat, and then everybody else sat down. And the president turned, which has always been the case, to a member of the cabinet to offer a prayer. Every cabinet meeting I ever attended started with a prayer. Don Rumsfeld, Secretary Rumsfeld, offered the prayer that morning, and it was a wonderful prayer. And then the president called on the Secretary of State for a report, consistent with his cue cards. Then he called on the Secretary of Defense for a report. But then he reached and he took the cue cards and he turned them over. And he leaned forward and he looked around the cabinet table, right in the eyes of every member of the cabinet. And he said, "We are at war. But while we are at war, We have a job of governing to do. And then with phenomenal specificity, he addressed every member individually in the cabinet. And he talked about their job of governing. And his level of knowledge about the issues that had to be addressed at the cabinet agencies was phenomenal, including the drug czar, the budget director, the trade representative, obviously the Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of State, Secretary of Health and Human Services, Secretary of Housing, Urban Development, Secretary of Transportation. He talked issues. He focused on education and housing. Then the press came in and they snapped their pictures, and everybody got up and they left the cabinet meeting. And they all went out and piled into those limousines that you see in Washington. But remember, there was a lot of paranoia then. So there were people with real guns hanging around those limousines. And as people piled into the limousines and they drove off, they all headed to the same place. It was the highest point in Washington, D.C., the National Cathedral. I don't know if you've been there, but it's a huge building. And we entered that building, every pew was filled. There were representatives of almost every faith in America. There were former presidents there, senators, congressmen, governors, ambassadors, representatives of the military, doctors and nurses, the President of the United States. We sang hymns, we said prayers. The Reverend Billy Graham gave a great sermon, and then the President addressed us. And he reminded us of a higher power and a greater calling. And he prayed for a nation. He prayed for the world. And we sang another hymn, and we left. We piled into Suburbans, and we drove out to Andrews Air Force Base. And as we're driving into the Air Force Base, there that beautiful 747 is with the words United States of America on the fuselage. The limousine stopped, and the president, without a lot of pomp and circumstance, jumped out of the limousine and bounded up the stairs to the plane. And as soon as he got on that plane, it became Air Force One. The door shut, we rumbled down the runway, and we lifted off, and we went to Trenton, New Jersey. We landed and got off the plane and were met by the governor of New York and the mayor of New York City. And we went to a helicopter, got into the helicopter, and it became Marine One. And we lifted off, and we flew out to the coast of New Jersey and then up the coast, and the sky was eerie. Not because there were clouds or anything, but because there were no planes in the sky. And when you saw Liberty Airport at Newark, there were no planes on the runway. You looked over and saw JFK, no planes on the runway. And then you saw her, the Statue of Liberty, and she looked beautiful. The torch was just glistening, and she looked beautiful. But then there was a pillar of smoke coming from the tip of Manhattan. And the helicopter went over to that pillar of smoke, and everybody stopped talking on Marine One. And the helicopter circled that pillar of smoke twice. And we were peering out the windows, and no one said a word. We went over and landed in Wall Street on a pier. The president got off of Marine One and he piled into a Suburban. The staff piled into other Suburbans, and we zipped through the streets of New York City. Now, I've been to New York City many, many times with presidents, and they're usually greeted all different ways. There's apathy, there are cheers, there's anger, there's single-digit hellos. It's just a different experience. This was a very different experience because the streets were empty except for people wearing hard hats. And police barricades lined the route all the way down to where the World Trade Center towers had stood. And I heard the president say to the Secret Service, "I want you to stop the limo because I want to get out." And then I could hear the chatter with the Secret Service. They're saying, "Nobody's gone through a magnetometer. We really don't think you should get out." But the president said, "Stop the limo. I want to get out." The limousine stops. It was a Suburban. And the president gets out, and he goes over to these police barricades. And on the other side are the men and women wearing hard hats. And they're the rescue workers. And there were all kinds of emotion. People were cheering. People were angry. There was clearly resolve. And the president is working his way down the barricade when all of a sudden somebody starts chanting, "USA, USA." And it builds and it builds and it's building. And I see someone hanging off of scaffolding chanting, "USA, USA." And they have Japanese flags on their uniform. And there's a team of rescue dogs. And the handlers of those rescue dogs are chanting, "USA, USA," and they have Canadian flags on their uniforms. And then the president works his way down to what we now call Ground Zero, and there's a crushed vehicle. Turns out it was a crushed fire vehicle. And the crowd is chanting. I went over to the president, I said, "Mr. President, would you be willing to say something?" And he said to me, or he asked, "Do you think it's appropriate?" And I said, "Yes." And I turned to Karl Rove and a staffer by the name of Nina Bishop, and I said, "See if you can find a bullhorn." And I don't know how Nina Bishop found one, but she did. And I went to the Secret Service, and I said, "The president is going to try to get up on that crushed vehicle." And an agent went up there and kind of did the old... And then they pulled the firefighter up and said, "Hold this spot." And then the president got up there. And he stood with his arm around the firefighter, a fellow by the name of Bob Beckwith. I'll never forget his helmet number, 164. And the president started to talk. The crowd is still chanting, "USA, USA," but it's starting to die down, and he's trying to talk over them. And then somebody yells out, "I can't hear you! I can't hear you!" And the president says, "I can hear you, and the whole world will hear us." And the crowd erupts. "USA, USA." The president climbs down off of that crushed vehicle, get back into those Suburbans, and we start heading up towards the Jacob Javits Center. The Jacob Javits Center is a convention center. It is mammoth. I've been in it many times for auto shows and all kinds of things like that. And we went into a room that had been partitioned with that pipe and blue drape into lots of little rooms, booths. And in those booths were volunteers that were there to serve as the next round of rescue workers down at Ground Zero. And they came from every state in the Union and 38 other countries. And the limousines came to a stop, and the president got out, and he went to every single unit and thanked them for being there and rallied them on, took his picture with them, patted the dogs. Then he piled back in that limousine, and he thought we were going to leave. but we took a left, went to another part of the Jacob Javits Center, and there was a large room that had been set up. Yes, it was pipe and blue drape. The limousine came to a stop. The Secret Service agent opened the door. An advance man was standing there, and the president got out, and the advance man said to the president, "Mr. President, we've got a microphone and a podium at the front of this room on a little stage. We thought you could make some remarks." And the president said, "Well, who's in the room? Who is this?" He said, "We've gathered some of the family of the policemen and firemen that are missing down at the World Trade Center." And the president said, "I am not going to the podium." And he just walked into the room. He walked in ahead of the Secret Service. Usually when the president walks in a room, someone with an earpiece walks in first, and you all know, and you stand up. When the president walked in this time, almost nobody was standing. And he went right to them. Oh, there was hope. My husband's a professional. He knows what he's doing. He'll be fine. My son has been trained. This is what he lived for. My daughter, she's strong. There was tremendous fear, a lot of anger, awful lot of prayers, awful lot of tears, lots of hugs. The president went to literally every single person in that room. He went to them. They didn't come to him. Then he turned and he started to walk out of the room. And there was a woman sitting in a chair. She was actually one of the first people he saw when he walked into the room. A short, heavy-set woman. And she stood up and walked over to the president and looked him right in the eyes. And she said, "Mr. President, I want you to have this." And she stuck out her hand. And she said, "This is my son's badge. His name is George Howard. Don't ever forget him." And she dropped the badge in the president's hand. Everybody is crying. The president looks at Mrs. Howard, and I'll never forget what he said. "Mrs. Howard, America will forget. They'll start to move on. But you don't have to worry about me. I will never forget." And with tears streaming down his cheeks, he turns and he walks out of the room. He put the badge in his pocket. The door to the limousine opens up, and we sit in the back seat. The limousine is leaving the Jacob Javits Center, and the president's not saying anything. Tears are still streaming down our cheeks, and the president reaches over into his pocket. He pulls out the badge. He opens his hand and looks at it. It was badge number 1012. And he squeezes it. He holds it. Then he puts it in his pocket. We arrive at the helicopter landing zone, and the president gets out of the limousine and goes over and takes his picture with the firefighters and the policemen that were there to protect the helicopter. The staff gets on the helicopter. The president gets on the helicopter, the door shuts, the helicopter lifts off for the flight back to Trenton. Nobody's talking. Nobody says anything the entire long ride back to Trenton. Helicopter lands at Trenton. And the staff rushes off the helicopter and they go to that 747 and climb up the stairs. The president and I turn to a small jet. And we walk up the stairs, the president first, I follow. And there's a pilot and a co-pilot, a communications officer, a flight attendant, a military aide with the so-called football, Secret Service agent, doctor, and me. And I'm sitting at a table right opposite the president. The door shuts to the plane, and we start rumbling down the runway. It lifts off, and the president is slouched in his chair. I'm convinced he's exhausted. Physically exhausted, mentally exhausted, emotionally exhausted. I believe he's spiritually exhausted. And I said to him, "Mr. President," he looks up at me. I said, "Thank you." And he said, "What?" I said, "You are a great president." And he leans forward and he opens his eyes wider. "What?" I said, "You're a great president. You did everything today that a president needs to do. You changed the mission of a federal bureaucracy, the FBI. You reminded the cabinet that while we're at war, our government has a job to do. As Commander-in-Chief, you called for the convening of the War Cabinet. You prayed for a nation and reminded us of a greater calling. You told the world they would hear us. You rallied the rescue workers, and you comforted the victims. And all he did was say to me, "Thank you." We landed at Hagerstown, Maryland, right near Camp David. That night we went to Camp David and everybody was exhausted. But that was the day that I will never forget, because I watched a president lead during a crisis in every aspect of leadership that is necessary. And he couldn't have done it if it hadn't been for the Constitution that gave him the authority, the faith that gave him strength, and the people who rallied to help. With that, I say thank you and God bless you. Can we take any questions?
Yeah, let's do some questions.
I'd be glad to take questions if any of you have questions. I will admit to being hearing impaired, so I'm always struggling to hear what people are saying to me. It was a great advantage to pretend I heard what people said to me when I was working at the White House. It's a liability now that I'm in academia. Judge Starr.
Could you comment? Thank you. Was that wonderful? Could you comment on the president dealing with world leaders in those earliest days?
President Bush, we call him number 43. 41 was his dad. President Bush, number 43, was so blessed to have had the experience of his father to reflect on. His father is probably, he was probably the most prepared person ever to be elected president of the United States. But among the preparation that his dad has was relationship building with world leaders during peaceful times and then challenging times, and those relationships made a difference. George W. Bush didn't have that luxury of experience, but he had the luxury of witnessing how an experienced leader made a difference. So very quickly, President Bush reached out to world leaders, number one, to comfort them, but number two, to invite them, and number three, to challenge them. And it started right on September 11th, 2001, on that plane ride from Sarasota, Florida, when we flew to Barksdale Air Force Base, and then up to Stratcom up in Omaha, and then eventually made it back to Washington, D.C. Because one of the first calls he made was actually to President Putin. And it was a phone call that no one on the staff recommended he make. He said, I better call President Putin so he doesn't think we're using this as a reason to attack. So he called President Putin to put him at ease. That phone call built a lot of goodwill, because it was not, and even President Putin knew it wasn't greased beforehand, because usually those phone calls are orchestrated from staff to staff to staff, somebody be at the phone. That was not the case. But he also called other world leaders, our great allies, during the course of the days 9/11, 9/12, 9/13, to help explain what was happening. He also made a statement that really changed American foreign policy. A very, very controversial statement, but it really did change American policy, and he said it the night of September 11th when he addressed the American people. He basically said, you're either with us or against us. That's not the challenge that most world leaders want to hear. And it's dramatic what happened as a result of that, because Muammar Gaddafi was like the first person to call up and say, I'm with you, I am with you, I am with you. Don't think I'm going to do anything stupid. And of course, General Musharraf in Pakistan is going, oh, don't make me decide, please don't make me decide, I want to be on both sides, please help me. So it was a very challenging thing to do, and I'm sure the diplomats at the State Department were saying, oh no, tear down that wall moment. But his relationship with world leaders was critical. I would say probably the most critical relationship that the president developed that was a surprise to both of them was his relationship with Prime Minister Tony Blair. They come from different philosophical persuasions. Their relationships were with different people, so they didn't even have common friends. And they were skeptical of each other, and it was evident as I witnessed the body language when they first met. But they ended up becoming unbelievably close and respected allies. And if you read, I think it's one of the best books describing both what happened in the War on Terror and the build-up to the war in Iraq. Prime Minister Blair's autobiography, My Journey in Politics. To me, it's the pretty accurate description of the buildup that I witnessed. The foreword to that book, I think, is a reflection of why President Bush was so successful in leading during a time of great challenge. And I'm not going to say he wasn't controversial. Yeah, he was controversial. First of all, he was elected president by the Supreme Court. Yeah, you're controversial. But Prime Minister Blair, in the foreword to his book, says, America wants to be loved. And then he says, but it can't be loved. It must be respected, admired, or feared. And America must always lead, because nobody else will. That's quite a dramatic thing for the Prime Minister of Great Britain to say. And I think those statements, respect, admiration, and fear, are critical to success in national security policy. Respected by your allies, admired by the neutrals, and there are always some neutrals. Switzerland will always be neutral. And fear. You want your enemies to fear you. Now, would we like to be loved? Yes. Will we earn it? Not enough for other people to say they love us because of it. they'll only love us if they know that there are people who respect us, admire us, and fear us. But I think that's a pretty dramatic statement. But I watched the relationship between Prime Minister Blair and George W. Bush become so close that they were a true complement, and that's a compliment with an E, complement to each other. They also offered occasional compliments with an I. And that's not an easy thing to do when you don't share the philosophy or the partisanship. But they did offer compliments with an I. And one of the most sensitive aspects I saw in that was just before the war in Iraq, when Prime Minister Blair was having a very, very tough time with his own caucus. And the UN was taking action or not taking action. They were calling for action, but they were slow walking. And Prime Minister Blair was struggling with the challenges within his own caucus. And President Bush was very sympathetic. I don't think he'd quite got to the point where he was empathetic, because our party was still pretty united at that point, but he was sympathetic to the challenge that Prime Minister Blair had, and he helped to work with Prime Minister Blair to accommodate the challenges he had in his own party back in Great Britain. And I think that also earned a lot of respect. But I watched the president. He wasn't the most likable president because, among other things, he didn't party with the world leaders. He was serious with the world leaders. He was not known as a party animal. He didn't check the wine out at every dinner. He was very serious about it. He was a man of faith, and he was a man of deliberate action. He was also quite transparent. He's got more of his mother in him than his dad. So what you saw is what you got. But I think that relationship, being Prime Minister Koizumi in Japan, they became very close friends and allies. The French are always a challenge to deal with. Are any of you French? Chancellor Merkel came in later on, and she was a joy to work with. But I think he ended up having a respectful relationship with the other world leaders. The politics were tough on the other world leaders if they showed him respect, and he knew that. So their private relationships were always better than their public relationships, but I think that it worked. I don't know if I answered your question, but that's right. Any questions? I don't want to say this, but I spoke to a bunch of students earlier today, and they were fabulous with their questions, but they started off a little bit sexist. The men asked the questions, and the women didn't say much until I challenged the women to ask questions. So does anybody have any other questions? Yes?
We're kind of like in this haze, I guess. And so I just want to know why people like you and Karl Rove, why instead of moving towards maybe more sound path,
We don't have good PR.
why you felt necessary to usher the American people and the world into a conflict that has resulted in so many civilian casualties. It's essentially dwarfed the casualties that 9/11 has brought a long time ago. And it doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, you say the challenges of going to war. Believe me, nobody I know wants to go to war ever. So this is not where I did not have a burden trying to manage warmongers. Nobody wants to go to war. Presidents are the last to want to go to war because they carry a burden for the rest of their life. Think about it. A president takes an oath in the Constitution, right from Article 2, that calls for him to protect us. He doesn't get to ask permission of anybody else. Oh, I should point out, on September 14th, President Bush actually got permission from Congress. There was a unanimous vote in the United States Senate to allow the president or authorize the president to use force. And in the US Congress, there was only one vote in opposition. That was Barbara Lee from California. Other than that, it was a unanimous vote in Congress to give President Bush the authorization to use military might to deal with the war on terror. Unanticipated, because it's always a challenge constitutionally to ask for Congress to give that authority. They did, and they did it on September 14th, 2001, and that was another part of that most memorable day. So President Bush had the authority to do that. But going to war is never easy. Can I flash and tell you another quick story that relates to this? Working for President Bush, the first President Bush, I was Deputy White House Chief of Staff before I was Secretary of Transportation. And you may remember this. We had lots of problems with Panama and a fellow by the name of Noriega. And Noriega had gone and captured some Americans down by the Canal Zone and put them in jail and held them, and he was dealing with all kinds of drug czars and mafia types and everything. He was a bad guy. And the deputies, there wasn't a great debate in America about it, but there was a great debate at the National Security Council and the Deputies Committee. And what do we do about it? What do we do about the Americans that are being held in these prisons with no reason? And I remember the National Security Council got together and looked at all of the options. What are our options? And finally, there was an option that suggested we should send troops down there to rescue the Americans and to arrest Noriega and wrest him from power and then arrest him. And came to a kind of a penultimate moment where people gathered in the Oval Office to consult with the president, and remember Secretary of State Baker and Chief of Staff John Sununu and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Bill Crow, and we had Brent Scowcroft there. It was the FBI Director Bill Webster. Anyway, we're meeting in the Oval Office, and I was kind of the easel guy with the charts, and very serious conversation. And Secretary Baker gets up and he said, well, Mr. President, and they are best friends. He said, Mr. President, I'm going to leave you to your decision, because this is not my decision to make, it's not our decision to make, it's your decision to make, so I'm going to leave you with the decision. And he walks out. And everybody follows him. I'm the easel guy. I'm folding up the easel, collecting the photographs, and the satellite photographs, and the president goes over and sits behind his desk, and he sits down. I believe he's praying. His hands are folded on the desk, his head is down, and then he looks up, and I'm standing maybe 15 feet in front of him, but I'm really not there. I'm a piece of furniture. And he says, I'm making a decision that will cost young men their lives. And he gets up out of a chair, he goes to the door to the Rose Garden, and he goes for a walk around the South Lawn. I leave the Oval Office, and I am literally shaking. And I'm saying to myself, I just watched a president make a presidential decision. But I was impressed that it was a decision that recognized the consequence. I now want to fast forward. Same president, same job, except I was the acting chief of staff on a trip to Cincinnati, Ohio. We arrived for an education event in Cincinnati. Prior to the trip, I had to do the planning to make sure the president knew what he was going to do when he got there. And among the things I would do was like check all the mail from the 3 contiguous zip codes who had written to the president in the previous 2 months, so that we kind of knew what people were saying on their mind. And I came across a letter that was a very, very angry letter. And it said, I really want to meet with you, Mr. President, because I want to look you in the eye and call you a murderer because you murdered my son. And I want to meet with you. And I'm going, ooh. And we were going to be in that zip code. And I'm troubled, and there's an action officer for every piece of correspondence that comes into the White House. The action officer on this particular document was Brent Scowcroft, the National Security Advisor. So I get down to Brent Scowcroft's office and show him the thing. He didn't really remember much about it, but he said, the Defense Department will handle that. It was shoveled off to the Defense Department to handle. My little pager, this was before cell phones, my pager goes off and it had my little code, go to the Oval Office. So I go down to the Oval Office, go in to see the president, and the president starts talking about something else, and he says, Andy, what's the trouble? You look upset. I said, oh, don't worry about it. He said, no, what's bothering you? And I said, well, I'm planning your trip to Cincinnati in a couple weeks and dealing with some issues. He said, well, what is it? And I said, well, you got a letter from a woman who was asking, said she wanted to meet with you, and it was kind of an angry letter, and she wanted to meet with you because her son died. And the president said, well, I should meet with her. If I'm going to be there, I should meet with her. We went to Cincinnati, arrived at the school. The president went into the gymnasium, gave an education speech. The family arrived at the school, and I went down to greet them. And it was a mother and a stepdad and a brother and a sister. And I greet them, and boy, were they angry. The mother was particularly angry, and I took them into a classroom. Marlon Fitzwater, President Bush's press secretary, was with me, and he finally turns to me and says, I'm leaving this one to you. And I'm talking to the parents, and then the speech finishes. I go out and see the president. He's walking down. I say, they're very upset. He says, of course they are. And he walked in, and sure enough, the mother really gave it to the president. I want to look you right in the eyes and say, you are a murderer. You murdered my son. And the president said, your son was a hero. Your son was a patriot. And I couldn't do my job if it weren't for people like your son. And I'm so grateful that you gave him to this country. And people start crying. And the president hugs the mother. And he says, tell me all about him. I want to know about him. And she talks about him. He talks to the brother and the sister and the stepdad. And then the mother reaches in her purse. And she takes out a letter and she says to the president, I want you to have this. And the president takes it and he puts it in his breast pocket on his suit. And we go out and get in the back of the limousine, and the back of the limousine, the president is there, and he reaches into his pocket, he opens up, takes the letter out, opens it up, and it's a letter written in pencil. And it's written by, I think, a 7th grader. And it says, when I grow up, I want to be a soldier. And I'm not afraid to die for my country. And it was written by the young man who died for his country. So nobody likes war. The consequences are huge. But sometimes war is necessary. I find comfort in Ecclesiastes. We talk about time, and most people think of an hour. In Ecclesiastes, time is not an hour. Presidents have to deal with the reality there are different times. And I pray that our presidents find the courage to discern what time is it. Is it a time for peace? Is it a time for war? That's the burden the president carries, but nobody likes war. I got in trouble. I served on the Iraq study group. If you Google me, you'll find all this. How evil was the Iraq study group? Well, I should tell you that any major issue that the White House has, they create interagency groups to deal with the issue. Interagency means you bring the departments that are involved in that particular issue, and it is not a policy group. It is really a communications group, and it's really meant to be communications inside government, even more than communications outside of government. So that, for example, the Defense Department would know what the U.S. Agency for International Development is doing, and the U.S. Agency for International Development what the State Department is doing, and the NSC would coordinate all of it, and the Justice Department. So an interagency group is the norm on any major issue. Yes, there was an interagency group on Iraq, and if there hadn't been one, that would have been negligent. but it was not a group designed to, quote, offer propaganda on the war, or false direction, or hide anything. It was a group to develop a way for people to communicate with each other inside government, and then to decide how best to reach people at the right time outside of government with what was happening. I think I've given you another speech, and I didn't mean to. I apologize. One more question? I see too many yawns I'm going to let you get to sleep. If there are no more questions, thank you very much for being a wonderful audience.